Well, Paul Manafort's guilty plea today might be the single worst development in Donald Trump's life, and it might be the single worst development in Donald Trump Jr.'s life, because Paul Manafort was in the room with Donald Trump Jr. in Trump Tower during the presidential campaign meeting that Donald Trump Jr. arranged with a group of Russians who promised dirt on Hillary Clinton. Paul Manafort has promised to tell Special Prosecutor Robert Mueller every single thing that happened in that room. Every word that Paul Manafort can remember was said in that room, and what Paul Manafort remembers might lead to the first federal criminal prosecution of the son of a president of the United States. Paul Manafort could be the key witness in a case that would be entitled The United States of America versus Donald Trump Jr. And President Trump could once again be identified as an unindicted co-conspirator in such a case if Paul Manafort and others can testify credibly that presidential candidate Donald Trump knew about that meeting and was a participant in a conspiracy to obtain dirt on Hillary Clinton from Russians. And so the big news of the day for anyone named Donald Trump is that Robert Mueller has a new witness, a big new witness. And that is even bigger news than that witness saying in court today, I plead guilty. Paul Manafort spent this week telling the special prosecutor's team everything he knows about every crime he has committed or every crime he knows about. Some of Paul Manafort's crimes were described in court today by Andrew Weissman of the special counsel's office, but Prosecutor Weissman was careful to point out that nothing that he publicly described in court today includes anything that Paul Manafort has told the special prosecutor in his first week of cooperation with the special prosecutor. So there is a lot more to come from Paul Manafort. And we know that the special prosecutor reached this plea bargain agreement with Paul Manafort today because Paul Manafort has already provided and will continue to provide valuable information to the special prosecutor. The moment that officially changed Donald Trump and Donald Trump Jr.'s lives came after Andrew Weissman outlined the crimes that Paul Manafort confessed to this week: conspiracy, obstruction of justice, conspiracy against the United States. Judge Amy Berman Jackson said to Paul Manafort, so are you prepared to tell me now whether you wish to plead guilty or whether you wish to go to trial? And Paul Manafort said, I am. And the judge said, and what is your decision? And Paul Manafort said, I plead guilty. And with that, every member of the Trump campaign team who has been charged by Robert Mueller has now pleaded guilty. Every single one of them. Robert Mueller and his team are undefeated against the Trump team. And everyone in the Trump team who was ever in a room with Paul Manafort or on the phone with Paul Manafort or sent an email to Paul Manafort or received an email from Paul Manafort has to try to fall asleep tonight wondering who's next. Who will Paul Manafort hand over to Robert Mueller? Leading off our discussion now, Jill Wine-Banks, former Assistant Watergate Special Prosecutor and an MSNBC legal contributor. And also joining us is former federal prosecutor Glenn Kirschner. And Jill, as Rachel mentioned at the top, there were a couple of ways for this to go today. There wasn't a lot of suspense left in whether he was going to plead guilty, but he could have just walked in there and pleaded guilty. Could have just done that and sat back and hoped and waited for his pardon. But he didn't. He went all the way over the line and is now on Team Mueller.
And you know what that says to me? That says how untrustworthy Donald Trump is, that his campaign advisor, his campaign chief, couldn't rely on him for a pardon and had to take the chance of going with full disclosure to the prosecutor and cooperating. That's what it says to me. And it's a big break because he's someone who was in at least several key meetings, including, of course, the June meeting in Trump Tower, which has been very much a focus of the investigation and could be part of the conspiracy to work with Russia on the campaign to affect the outcome of the election. And so it's a very important time for Mueller. And as you pointed out, it is 100% win for Mueller and 0 for Team Trump.
Glenn Kirschner, your perspective on what we saw in court today.
So, Lawrence, I think it's a hugely consequential turn of events for both the Mueller investigation and for the president and his administration. When I got a hold of a copy of the plea agreement in the Manafort case earlier today, I was looking for one phrase, and I found it on page 2, paragraph 3. And let me just read the legalese and then talk about what it actually means. It says that no other charges will be brought against the defendant, Paul Manafort, for his heretofore disclosed participation in criminal activity. In layman's terms, Lawrence, what that means is the following. When we meet with a defendant who is an aspiring cooperating witness, we interview them over and over and over again, and we frankly try to wring dry every drop of information that the cooperator has about the criminal conduct of others, but equally important, the criminal conduct of Mr. Manafort himself. Because the last thing we want, as I was a career prosecutor, the last thing a prosecutor wants is for there to be any surprises about the crimes a cooperator committed before we make the decision to bring them on board as a cooperating witness. And there's a benefit to the cooperator when he sits down with the prosecutors and provides all that information about his own criminal conduct. We put a term like this in his plea agreement, and it says, as long as you've told us about other crimes you've committed, you get a pass. You basically get immunity because we rolled it into today's plea agreement. So what that means is he could have sat down and provided all sorts of information about him, Mr. Manafort, personally colluding with Russians to undermine the election, coordinating that with the president, with Don Jr., with Jared Kirschner, with others. I'm not saying he did that. We have to wait and see. But if he provided that information, that is probably what prompted Robert Mueller, after the many meetings that they had, which we learned about in today's hearing, Robert Mueller to say, you know what, Mr. Manafort, you brought enough value to the process as a cooperator that we are going to give you a plea agreement even after you've been convicted in one of your criminal cases. Lawrence, that leads me to conclude Paul Manafort must have Blockbuster information. He's provided it to the special counsel, and now we have to wait for the next very large shoe to drop.
Yeah, and Jill, to that point, in general terms, certainly in all of these kinds of agreements that I've ever seen and witnessed in court, the person, the thing of value that they tend to be giving over is someone bigger than themselves. It's someone above them in the chain of command of whatever enterprise they're in. It is of value still to hand over material on people who are kind of below you in that target list by prosecutors. But to Glenn's point, given how good a deal, as you could describe it, how good a deal this is for Paul Manafort at this stage, given how clearly guilty he is, you certainly get the feeling that something large has been handed over to Robert Mueller this week.
I think we can assume that that is true, that it would either be Jared Kushner or Donald Trump Jr. or the president himself. There is, of course, I want to caution, there is the possibility that it was just, I'm willing to take responsibility, I'm willing to plead guilty to my own crimes, I don't want to pay for a defense, I don't want to make the government pay for the prosecution, and I'm just giving up, he's forfeiting almost all of his assets, his real estate, his bank accounts. So he may just feel like, well, that's what I'm doing, and there may be nothing more. But given the language that was used in court in terms of the plea agreement itself, I agree with Glenn that it is very likely that he has told them quite a great deal. And Glenn is right. You wouldn't take a plea agreement unless you had had a proffer of all the evidence that the witness has before you would agree to it. So I think we can look forward to many weeks and months of disclosures and new indictments that may be the result of this, and to the investigations that will follow up on the details that he provided to them in the proffer leading up to the plea agreement.
Let's listen to some of the spin that Rudy Giuliani offered on Fox News tonight, and then we will analyze what he had to say after we listen to this.
The plea is to crimes that have to do with Manafort's past. No involvement with President Trump, no involvement with the campaign, no involvement with Russia. And by the way, there's also no evidence of obstruction. There have been 4 guilty pleas now, and they're completely irrelevant.
Glenn, your reaction to that?
You know, Lawrence, I've heard this over and over again from either the president himself or Sarah Huckabee Sanders or Mr. Giuliani. They keep complaining and protesting with each guilty plea that's obtained, with each conviction that's obtained. They complain that that conviction, that guilty plea doesn't prove Russian collusion. And, you know, I can envision the 3 of them sitting in a movie theater, and every time they watch another trailer, a preview of coming attractions, they sit there and they complain that this is not the movie. This is not the movie. We all know this is not the movie. We all know these cases that have been brought thus far by Mr. Mueller are not the Russian collusion cases. But guess what? The movie's coming, and the movie will be when Mr. Mueller makes that decision whether to issue a report that ultimately will be released to Congress about his findings, or drop a great big conspiracy indictment on everybody who may have participated in a conspiracy with Russia to undermine our presidential elections and obstructed by perhaps covering it up. That will be the movie. All of these other things are just the previews of things to come.
And let's consider Rudy Giuliani's most insane comment of the night to the Fox News audience. And I don't know how much of this they actually take as real, but Rudy Giuliani says he's hanging his head in shame because the Justice Department has found crimes and decided to prosecute those crimes. Let's listen to this.
My head hangs in shame for the department that I gave 16 years of my life to, the Department of Justice, as the 3rd-ranking official in the Department of Justice, when I could proudly say it was a Department of Justice. And the only thing that could be done now is as relentless an investigation of all these people as they did to President Trump.
Jill, your reaction to that?
My reaction is that we have seen a march to the truth. We have seen cases build upon cases, and each person who has pled guilty has been from the Trump team and has said, I committed crimes. One of them said in court under oath that he committed a crime at the direction of the president himself. You can't get any better than that. And the fact that all of these people have pled guilty shows how carefully Mueller has proceeded and how he has developed the evidence. All you have to do is read the information that Manafort pled guilty to today. It is a detailed layout of all of the things that he did, all the conversations he had, all the illegal transfers of money he had. Mueller has facts. And just like Paula Duncan concluded in the first Manafort trial, although she is a loyal Trump supporter, and although she said the investigation is a hoax and a witch hunt, she said, but the evidence against Manafort was real. Those were facts, and I voted to convict him on 18 counts. And I'm hoping that the American people will start to see the facts once Mueller either issues an indictment that names higher-ups or issues a report that names them and spells out in detail what they have done wrong. That's when people will start to see the truth and will turn their opinion and vote in the way that they should against the Trump team who has committed these crimes.
And Rudy Giuliani and the Trump team always seem to forget that Michael Flynn actually pleaded guilty to committing crimes in the White House while in the Trump administration. Jill Wine-Banks, Glenn Kirschner, thank you both for starting off our discussion tonight. Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.